Hi, this is Brad Linder with Liliputing, and this is a tale of two tiny laptops. This is the One Mix Yoga on the left and the GPD Pocket 2, or a prototype of the Pocket 2, on the right. And what's interesting about these little guys is that they're both basically laptop computers with small 7-inch displays and little keyboards, and they're small enough that you can basically fold them up and put them into a pocket, assuming you have relatively large pockets. GPD, as the name suggests, is on its second generation. This is the Pocket 2. There was a Pocket 1, which came out about a year ago, had an Intel Atom processor and slightly different design and a couple of feature differences. The One Mix Yoga came out earlier this year, and in a lot of ways it felt almost like a second generation Pocket, because it had a couple of features that the original Pocket didn't, including a backlit keyboard, a 360-degree hinge that allows you to hold it and use it like a tablet, and support for pen input. Now, in terms of performance, it actually has a slower Intel Atom processor than the original Pocket. So when I previewed it, I noticed that there were a couple of bugs that needed to be worked out in the prototype, and in the final version, they were worked out. But in terms of performance, it was much slower than I would have expected it to be, and that made it kind of painful to use, in spite of having those sort of bonus features. Now, GPD has sent me this Pocket 2 to test, and I wanted to take a look at the two devices, because I think a lot of people are going to be comparing them. And while the Pocket 2 doesn't have all of these sort of extras, it doesn't have a 360-degree hinge, doesn't have a backlit keyboard, doesn't have pressure-sensitive pen input, it does have a significantly faster processor. Instead of an Atom chip, it has an Intel Core M3 7Y30 dual-core processor, which offers significantly better performance, and I think makes this a better option for most people who don't need the tablet features. If you could combine what's inside this device with the design of this device, and maybe a couple of sort of design elements from this one, I think you'd have a great machine. But as it is, I think the Pocket 2 is already pretty exciting, with a few caveats. So let's take a look at some of the features. First thing I'm going to do is go ahead and power them both on. So there's a power button that's sort of built right into the keyboard there, not my favorite placement. Here we've got a power button that's above the screen. Another thing that you'll notice here is that we've got an optical touch sensor, which works sort of like a touchpad right here between two parts of the spacebar. Here we've just got a small spacebar, and the optical touch sensor for moving the cursor is up here. The two keyboards, I generally prefer the one on the GPD Pocket 2. They both have pretty small keys, but I think the layout, the arrangement is just a little bit better here. It's a little bit more space between the keys. You don't wind up with these sort of minuscule punctuation mark keys here, or this weird caps lock key that you've got on the One Mix Yoga, which is almost attached to the A. And I think it's an upgrade over the original Pocket. I haven't actually used the original Pocket, but based on what I've seen, this is the layout's a little bit nicer, and I find that the action is a little bit nicer too. You get just a little bit more sort of bounce back. It's a nice tactile response. There's this sort of weird bar here above the keyboard, which is where you have things like your brightness and volume adjustments. It's sort of a solid strip as opposed to individual keys, but it works reasonably well. And you can see we've got little LED lights here for a couple of functions, including the power, and you can also turn off the fan if you find the fan to be too noisy. Now that will slow down performance probably. The optical touch sensor is a little bit weird, because whereas here we've got sort of the buttons below it for left and right click, here you have to reach all the way over onto the other side. So it's sort of a two-handed thing, or one hand and then move. Makes it a little bit more difficult to use. If you're primarily going to be using your fingers, it's not too big of an issue. The other thing is I find that this touch sensor is a little bit less sensitive. That might be something that can be tweaked in software, because again, this is a prototype. But I find that it's a little bit easier to move around on this model than on this one. But for the most part, I find that either plugging in a USB mouse or using my fingers is a little bit easier. And of course, on this model, we do have the option of using a pen if we wanted to do that instead. Now, while I'm talking, I'm going to go ahead and fire up Handbrake on both of these guys and transcode a video, just to give you a little idea of what to expect in terms of performance. As I mentioned, the One Mix Yoga is a slow computer. GPD Pocket 2 is not exactly a speed demon, but it's so much faster. It's a lot easier to use, particularly when you're doing a lot of multitasking. I've had no problem using it for web browsing, playing videos, even playing games and doing those sorts of activities. So what I've got here is a short video. It's actually an unboxing video I did in 480p a couple of years back. And I'm just going to tell it to save to the desktop. And then I'm going to go ahead and start transcoding, just using the default settings on each of these. All right, so already you can see here that we're getting an average, it says, of about 36 frames, 35 frames per second, versus an average of about 65 frames per second. So I can tell you it's going to finish transcoding that video much more quickly on the GPD Pocket 2. I don't know how well you can see it, but the backlit keyboard is illuminated here. In terms of sort of size and profile, you'll notice that while they're very similar in terms of screen size and keyboard size and everything else, this has a sort of smaller footprint, and that's for a couple of reasons. First of all, the lid actually extends down a little bit when you open it. That can make sort of reaching the bottom with your fingers a little bit tricky in the touchscreen, but it gives it a sort of low profile look and actually props up the keyboard a tiny bit if you extend it far enough. Whereas this model stays on top until you twist and change to tablet mode. When the video is transcoded, I'll also close them and show you a little bit in terms of sort of the size comparison. They're almost the same height. The GPD Pocket 2 is a little bit slimmer and it's a little bit lighter, but we're just talking a matter of a couple of ounces at most. Generally speaking, they're very close, but the Pocket 2 looks smaller, and that really has to do with sort of how the design is tapered and some of the choices that GPD made. We're at 74% finished versus 42% finished, so again, you can see how much more quickly it's getting done here. Now, these devices aren't really made for things like video editing or video transcoding. It's nice to know that you can do it, but the Core M3 processor is significantly better at it than the Intel Atom X5 processor on the One Mix Yoga. As I mentioned, I've been able to play games, watch videos, surf the web, and do multiple things at once using the GPD Pocket 2. Now, this is just a prototype that was sent to me. It has, again, a 1920 by 1200 pixel display, same size screen as on the One Mix Yoga, the Core M3 processor, and it's all finished, transcoding. This particular model has 8 gigs of RAM and 128 gigabytes of flash storage. There will also be a 4 gigabyte version in terms of RAM available. The One Mix Yoga has the Atom X5 processor, 8 gigs, and 128 gigs as well, but overall it adds up to a much less powerful machine. Still going, 72, 73, and at this point it says it's averaging about 26 frames per second. And again, this is just 480p standard definition video. High definition video will obviously take longer. So, generally speaking, if you could combine some of the features between these two devices, if you had support for the pen, if you had support for the 360-degree hinge so you could use it in tablet mode, this would be almost a no-brainer. It's a really, really nice little computer. As it is, it's so much faster that it's just much, much more pleasant to use. And while it doesn't open up to 360 degrees, it does open up at a almost 180-degree angle. So it is something that you can pick up and sort of hold in your hand this way if that's something that you really want to do for reading or using it on your lap or something along those lines. It does get rather warm. It can be sort of uncomfortably hot. The fan can get pretty loud. As I mentioned, you can silence the fan by pressing that button, but it will slow down the computer a little bit. 97%, we're almost there. So, if I had to choose between these two devices, I would probably still go with the GPD Pocket, even though it doesn't necessarily have all of the sort of bonus features, and it's finally finished. But it's, it's hard not to compare the two devices that look so similar, but in terms of functionality, the form factor here is different, the processing power is different. The tiny keyboards do make a lot of typing difficult. Maybe you can get used to it quicker than I can, but last night I wound up writing a document, and I actually found switching to my phone to be more comfortable because my fingers just started to feel cramped using these little keyboards on the Pocket 2 as well as using to type it. But But if you're doing sort of light stuff, web browsing, other things on the go, it's pretty nice. They're niche devices. They're not going to appeal to everybody, especially since they sell for around $500, $600. You could get a pretty good full-size laptop for that, but you can't fit it into your pocket the way that you can with these little guys. So as promised, I've closed them up, and if you take a close look, you'll see that the lid on the One Mix Yoga is a little bit higher. The lip here is sort of designed to make it look like it's much thinner in the front, but the bottom, I mean, it's lying flat here, and that's because of the way that it's sort of tapered here. So it just sort of folds up here and here to give it a slimmer look, but it's not actually that much slimmer. We've got ports on both sides here. We've got USB Type-C and USB Type-A, as well as a microphone there. Whereas all the ports are on one side of the One Mix Yoga. Here we got another USB headset, micro SD. Here we've got basically a similar arrangement of ports, except now we've got an HDMI port dedicated. It has a USB Type-C port, but it also has a micro USB. This model charges via micro USB. This model charges via a USB Type-C port. This model charges much more quickly. So not only does it do things faster, but you can recharge it much more quickly. I can't give you a hard number, but I can tell you that earlier today I'd run down the battery in both of them, plugged them in for a similar amount of time. This one came to, I don't know, it went from probably around 20% battery or 15% battery up to 30 in the time that this one went up to 50 or 60. So it does charge more quickly. Haven't had this long enough to tell you very much about battery life, but it's going to vary pretty widely depending on what it is that you're using it to do. If you stack them on top of each other, I think you get a nice sort of look at the fact that they really are pretty close to the same size, even though there's some materials that taper upwards on the GPD Pocket 2. There's also a nice little lip here that makes it a little easier to open the One Mix Yoga. The Pocket 2 has a nicer looking design overall, I'd say, but the One Mix Yoga has a slightly more versatile design. You'll also notice that there's ventilation here and here. Here we've got a nice big vent, and there's also vents sort of tucked in behind the hinge here. This one does sort of get pretty loud during extended usage, so it's nice to have the option of slowing it down, but again, it's going to do certain things more slowly when you do that. Sleeps when you put close the lid pretty quickly, pretty efficiently, and of course you can press the power button to do that as well. So overall, again, they're pretty similar in terms of size, in terms of shape, in terms of what you might want to do with a pocket-sized computing device. They run Windows 10, the full-fledged version of Microsoft's operating system. But whereas you get some bonus features like support for that pressure-sensitive pen, here you get a much faster processor for a slightly higher price. I would love to see a GPD Pocket 3 with the same processor or a faster model, and similar keyboard layout, maybe with the touch sensor here. The touch sensor on the GPD Pocket 2 was sort of a late addition. The company had originally showed prototypes that didn't have any touch sensor. The idea was you would just use it with a pen or maybe a capacitive or a passive stylus. And people said, no, you need something. And so they put this in at the last minute. Rearranging the keyboard area would have been difficult there. And, maybe one of the reasons why I prefer typing on this keyboard is because you don't have to make any accommodations to put something in the middle of it down here on the bottom. So it's sort of 6 of one and half a dozen of the other, I think, in terms of general design features. But in terms of performance, there's no comparison. This thing is painfully slow to the point where I think I would only recommend it if you really like doing one thing at a time and only one thing at a time. This model is basically a little computer. It feels competitive with, it's basically got the same processor as an entry-level Microsoft Surface Pro tablet or a Surface laptop, and it just happens to be a smaller device. Because of the small keyboard, it's something that you're probably not going to do a lot of writing on, but it is something that you can do some writing on. So let's, real quick here, do a little writing on. So, it's something you can do, but it takes a little getting used to. Likewise, here, the keyboard is small. but they're both serviceable. Again, mostly if you're going to use it for things like entering URLs, as opposed to writing diary entries or the Great American Novel or the Great French Novel or whatever language you happen to speak. Anyways, that is just sort of a quick look at the two devices side by side for comparison purposes. You can check out my YouTube channel or Liliputing.com for more details about the GPD Pocket 2. It's going up for pre-order on a crowdfunding campaign on July 30th, 2018, and it should begin shipping to customers, well, to backers of the campaign later this year, and then should be available via retail channels as well. This is Brad Linder with Liliputing and the One Mix Yoga and the GPD Pocket 2.